So, recently we've been discussing folk legends and looking at some of the key features that drove them. Now, many folk legends feature real people of history, creating stories so we can identify with them and feel a connection to our past. Well, these stories may have a grain of truth. They're often exaggerated in order to teach a lesson or elevate a person's admirable traits. Even when exaggerated to the point of fiction, those stories still featured real people. Today, we'll be moving on to a contrasting set of characters from folk tales. The difference between legends and tales being legends are of real people that could be true, while tales feature characters that are purely imaginative. Characters from folk tales can be quite interesting. Now, there are subsections of anthropology that focus entirely on analyzing the mythology of local folk tales in order to find out more of the value system in that time. Folktale characters, since they were created for the purpose of storytelling, often represent a certain value or personality that are used in a story to teach a lesson. By listening to folk stories and seeing which personalities and actions brought about reward or negative consequence, we can see what kind of persons that society valued and encouraged. The types of folk tales also vary widely within a region. For instance, there are three main types of Norwegian folk tales. One is animal stories, where the main characters are animals. Tamed or wild, they often behave like humans, talking or doing human activities while still retaining animal characteristics. Norway tended to feature animals like wolves, foxes, and bears. These stories were often aimed at explaining why an animal looked or acted like it did. For instance, a story of a bear and a fox features the bear being tricked into trying to ice fish with bait attached to its long tail. The ice then froze around the animal's tail, and when the bear stood up, the tail broke off in the ice. That kind of story would explain why bears had short stubbed tails. The next type of Norwegian folktale features the supernatural. They told tales of dragons and giants, trolls, and fae folk interacting with humans or with each other. A subset of this type of story is transformation stories. These focus on a human being turned into an animal and back. One story that's widely known in Norway is known as East of the Sun and West of the Moon. We'll be reading it later, so don't worry about notes at this point. Essentially, the story is about a prince who was human by sunlight, and when the sun set, he changed into a great white bear. This type of folktale also demonstrated many tropes that show up in other folktales. It begins with once upon a time, and has well-known characters like a poor but beautiful peasant girl and a charming prince. The format of the story is also traditional, with no more than two characters showing up in any conversation or scene. The peasant girl is the heroine, and they lived happily ever after. The story has many elements to it that are obviously fictional. The characters may act like normal people, but they're not based on historical figures. If a story involved a fantasy king, you could expect him to react much like a normal Norwegian king would act. Now, the third and main kind of folktale is comedy. We'll cover this more later, just be aware that the category exists. It contains elements of the supernatural, but generally they're more lighthearted and meant to pique humor more than the other stories. So, traditionally, people use speech and song to pass down folk tales orally. Each generation added their own flair to the tales or tweaking the story to fit their own ideas of moral righteousness. In Norway before the 1900s, folk tales were for children. They were something playful and educational, not really something worthy of intense study by scholars. In the mid-19th century, the Romantic movement began spreading through Europe. Romantics considered folktales to be a reflection of a culture's soul. People became more prideful of their country, and there was a renewed interest in traditional art and storytelling that was unique to their own country. As a result, Norwegian folktale collections started being published, the first coming out in 1852. Nowadays, those tales and legends are seen as an important part of what it means to be Norwegian.